Very pleased to welcome you to the 5th Annual Research Conference of the Banco de España. We value very much your participation and contributions to our flagship research conference, which exemplifies the Banco de España's commitment to economic research as a fundamental pillar for analyzing and designing economic policies. This year's conference is devoted to understanding the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. This was a major and unprecedented combination of shocks that, during 2020 and 2021, changed the world economy and economic policies in many dimensions. First, it affected both the demand and the supply sides of the economy. Second, having a global dimension, it had worldwide implications that, among other things, caused disruptions in global value chains that were transmitted across countries through international trade. Third, it had very different effects across households and firms depending on their levels of income, occupations, sectors of activity, and their ability to reorganize production under the very special circumstances created by the containment measures. Now, once the health problem caused by COVID-19 is more or less under control, and with some time perspective, it is natural to ask about the implications of those changes, its persistence over time, and to what extent the structural trends that were shaping the economy before 2020 will be modified or conditioned by how the economy and economic policies dealt with the pandemic. Thus, when selecting the papers for this conference, the scientific committee identified 4 main areas where the questions about the economic consequences of COVID-19 seem most relevant. These are international trade, inequality and the labor markets, technological change and productivity, and the macroeconomy. In my view, the selection of papers for this conference creates an excellent opportunity for an informed and profound debate about the likely long-lasting economic consequences of the pandemic. The papers to be presented approach these relevant topics from different angles. First, in the session on international trade, Paul Antrás will reflect on the extent to which the COVID-19 crisis is the starting point of a deglobalization trend and on how global value chains may be affected by the pandemic. In his analysis, Professor Antrás concludes that the future of globalization depends more on institutional and political factors than on technological developments. In the same session, Nytia Pandalai-Nayar will present her work with Habui, Senhuo, and Andrei. The authors show that imperfect news about economic fundamentals can generate large international fluctuations and that the effects of information frictions are amplified by the global production network. This analysis highlights the increasing importance of global value chains in shaping international trade and fluctuations. Our second session deals with inequality and the labor markets. First, Richard Blundell will present his work with Robert Joyce, Monica Costa-Diaz, and Xiaowei Xu. The authors argue that the COVID-19 pandemic has widened some pre-existing inequalities and opened up new divides. Indeed, the pandemic had heterogeneous effects across households, firms, sectors of activity, and occupations, but also across genders and regions. The authors argue that the pandemic is likely to leave many challenging legacies for inequality and that policymakers should turn their attention to the longer-term effects of the crisis. Afterwards, and focusing on the labor market, Antonella Trigari will present her work with Mark Girdler and Chris Huckfeld. The authors analyze the role of temporary layoffs in protecting employment during the pandemic. While the conventional view is that temporary layoffs smooth out unemployment dynamics, they argue that there is also a destabilizing effect associated to the loss of recall. They then analyze the effectiveness of job retention schemes implemented during the pandemic at protecting employment by fostering recall hiring. Our third session deals with technological change and productivity. In his work with Alexander Big and Adam Blundell, Karel Mertens focuses on the potential longer-run implications of working from home, which, as you know, experienced a notable boost during the Great Confinement. He and his co-authors argue that the observed heterogeneity in work from home transitions is consistent with potentially more permanent changes to work arrangements in some occupations, and not just temporary substitution in response to greater health risks. Afterwards, Paul Mizen will present his work with Nicholas Bloom, Philip Ban, and Pavel Smietanka, which follows a comprehensive approach to the topic of COVID-19 and productivity. Despite a significant reduction in TFP during 2020 and 2021 in many countries, mostly because of large reductions in within-firm productivity, they find surprisingly little expected lasting impact of COVID-19 on productivity, although with some heterogeneity across firms and sectors. Finally, the pandemic had important implications for the macroeconomy and macroeconomic policies, which is the topic of our fourth session. First, Luca Fornaro will present his work with Federica Romei, which studies optimal monetary policy when there is an increase in the relative demand of tradable versus non-tradable goods. This unbalanced nature of the post-COVID-19 recovery generates changes in relative prices that warrant a certain increase in domestic inflation. Notably, the authors point to the need of coordination across central banks in order to avoid an excessively tight global monetary policy stance. When thinking about monetary policy, one must, of course, think about inflation expectations. In this regard, the post-pandemic rise of inflation has had heterogeneous effects across households. Michael Weber will present his work with Yuri Gorodnichenko and Olivier Quabion, which uses US-matched microdata on household spending and inflation expectations to measure realized, perceived, and expected inflation. The authors find that dispersion in realized and perceived inflation explains a large share of the rise in dispersion in inflation expectations. It is now time to see the presentations and discussions. I'm sure we will have a very fruitful conference. Beyond that, I also hope you have the time and the opportunity to enjoy Madrid and your visit to Spain. Thank you very much.